even be a scenario where the Protestants discriminate against the Catholics, and the Catholics are perhaps particularly motivated to become richer in order to compensate for the lack of political rights. Yeah, you imagine, right, what a different explanation could be. But this shows that there is a risk of sort of any kind of macro analysis, which can be circumvented or even reduced by just going a level lower and just looking at the individual Protestants and Catholics, which may also help to avoid making mistakes about the direction of the causal arrow. Then when you operate then on the lower level, you may as well sort of be able to distinguish different micro mechanisms behind the same macro association. Again, the Weber example, we found that there was a dispute between Becker-Wössmann and Weber in the article about what mechanism actually produced the association between Protestantism and economic development, where Weber was on the side of the vocational and religious ethic then being the main driver, Becker-Wössmann then rather arguing that it was about the education effects, the Bible reading of Protestants, for instance, that creates human capital and hence more economic development. And you see there's a dispute about the micromechanisms, which can obviously be solved much easier once you have micro data that also address the micro level. Last but not least, when you think a little bit broader also about other disciplines, surgeries, for instance, when you know what the micromechanisms in producing a certain diseases, for instance, it's obviously much easier to intervene also in the social world. So it may be easier and to intervene and to also have better predictions. And this can be a last argument in favor of micro foundations. I also wanted to give you a couple of counter arguments because micro foundations is a little bit of a killer argument in the social sciences. If you don't use micro foundations, then this is basically seen as being a total discredit of your sort of social science attempts of theorizing and explaining. And one counter argument is simply that in many, let's say, explanation context is simply pragmatic to use the level of explanation that's sufficient in order for sort of your audience to understand what is going on. Yeah, so I mean, if I want to explain, for instance, why my neighbor is behaving strangely, it may be sufficient for me to say that he has drunk a lot of beer, yeah, and I don't need to step down one level and enter into the micro foundations of his sort of biology and metabolism. So how sort of beer eventually enters his body and brain functions in order to explain why his body is doing strange movements. Yeah. So in that pragmatic context, it's perfectly fine to use a macro level explanation and to not sort of go the ultimate steps of a micro foundation, this just being one example. And the same may hold for context of predictions and even interventions, where sometimes just macro relationships may be sufficient, even though they are wrong, right? And one such instance here is the miasma theory of diseases and malaria in particular, that sort of saw the main cause of diseases in sort of the fumes emanating from dead organic material. Yeah? And this is, I mean, we know this today, it's a wrong theory because we sort of know much more about bacteria than was known in the beginning of the 19th century when this theory was still held. But based on this theory, there were interventions made in the world. So, for instance, waters that contained sort of dead organic material were dried, and as a result of this, also then the real cause of malaria, which is obviously the mosquito transmitting the disease and which is breeding in these waters, which then were dried. These waters disappearing then also led to less malaria cases. And this not on the basis of this miasma theory being right or wrong, but simply because just there was this macro relationship between the presence of water and disease cases occurring. So get rid of the water and there are less disease cases. The micro mechanism at the time, the theory about the micro mechanism was wrong, but it wasn't even necessary for the intervention and prediction to work out. And this just being another, let's say, counter argument for let's say, against a strong statement that you always need micro foundations for good explanations, predictions, and interventions. So, Lars Oudin here, by the way, has probably written the most complete, also historical account of the history of methodological individualism, if you're interested in this, because we will go on a little bit here with game theory, which, some of you may know due to the colorful figure of the mathematician John Nash, whom you may know from this Hollywood movie Beautiful Mind, in which he is depicted probably not as the historical John Nash alone, but a little bit transformed for Hollywood purposes. So we are talking about a mathematical theory that formalizes sort of decision-making situations in situations where there is an interdependency, as in social interaction. So whatever actor A does depends on actor B. Whatever actor B does and decides depends on the actor A. And this was not just a mathematical theory, but was also applied in experimental economics. And up to the current day, many of the economics departments, most famously here in Germany in Bonn, Reinhard Selten and John Nash, they won together the Nobel Prize for economics. And in these experiments, mostly economic students are asked to behave given certain decision-making situations. The historical context in which this evolved was the Cold War and the arms race, where, there was Washington and Moscow, and each side didn't really know how to act given the level of information, being self-interested, obviously, but also having a certain interest in perhaps global security at the end of the day. And each side's then decision also depending on the other sides. And many of these early economists also worked for the RAND Corporation, a Cold War think tank that turned a little bit neoliberal also in the 1960s, 70s. And these were mathematicians who were basically just playing around with decision matrices and then also inventing like real life stories to them in order to make sense of them. We will see this in a second. So before we start introducing a couple of games though, let's clarify a little bit of vocabulary. So game is not just a fun thing, it's here in this context defined as a situation that is defined by certain situational parameters. There are actors in that game. So the game is defined by the payoffs the players receive as a function of how they behave in the game. They have different sort of strategies that they can put in place, and they have different decision options. The payoff matrix is at the end a matrix that displays basically who gets how many payoffs as a function of the decisions of him or herself and the other players. A dominant strategy is the name for a strategy that a player always plays independently of how the others decide. And then equilibrium in a game is then whenever a situation is reached when no player has a further incentive than to change the strategy. And an equilibrium may be called Pareto efficient. That is a term going back to an economist, Pareto, who wrote about this already in the 19th century. And the equilibrium is called Pareto efficient when then in an equilibrium, no player can improve her situation without another player losing anything. So when one player can improve her situation and another player sort of remains at the same payoff level, the equilibrium is still not Pareto efficient. Okay. So the experimental game theory, so that is practiced in sort of these artificial experimental labs at universities mostly, has mostly been used in order to criticize, let's say, hyper-rational models that were more developed by the mathematicians in the very beginning. And the upshot of many of these experiments is to bring these theories a little bit closer to the real world decision making, where altruistic behavior, orientation according to norms of fairness, for instance, in the dictator game, also play a role. So in the lecture on functionalism, we encountered a threefold definition of the so-called problem of order, which can also be modeled through game theory. So I recall there are conflicts that may be described as zero-sum games, right? So one gets something because the other one doesn't get it. There is the problem of uncertainties in coordination games or dilemmas, where I think I mentioned this problem, for instance, of husband and wife being lost in a foreign city, not finding an encounter place to meet again, and they both think it's the cathedral, and they go to this focal point of the cathedral to avoid one of the main problems of this uncertainty situation, which is expecting what the other expects, what I would expect, etc. So the infinity of expectations. Last but not least, beyond sort of these more distributional epistemic problems, there is also the problem of collective action, right? So this is a little bit more the Hobbesian problem of order. How do then actors sort of get themselves together and create sort of a state, for instance? And here, this may be modeled also as the prisoner dilemma, or more fundamentally, a problem of trust. Yeah. So let's start with an example of the first zero-sum game, which is also here the heads or tails game, for instance, matching pennies game, where we have two actors, right? Here, imagine we have A and B, and they both can toss a coin or a penny, and can be either heads or tails. And then the payoff matrix is designed in a zero-sum game where, so the